Hello, Classic Crew, and welcome to my channel where we explore political and cultural topics of the day in an in-depth and relatable way. Today, we are talking about a touchy subject, and that is whether or not marriage is patriarchal. I have been researching this for a while now, and it has been a journey. If you look up the history of marriage, almost every article you come across is going to tell you that marriage has historically been and currently is patriarchal. And initially, when I was looking at all of these articles, I was taking it down as fact. I was thinking to myself, okay, this must be true if everyone agrees with it. But that's the thing about journalism and the internet. Everything will start to sound the same because everyone is referencing the same thing. So I really had to take an in-depth deep dive to try and understand what the actual history is of marriage. What were its origins? Was it really to the benefit of men, or did it benefit women? Now, I'm not saying I have all the answers here, but I really want to explore with you guys today and have a conversation about it. Raise some questions that maybe the feminist narrative doesn't really cover and doesn't really answer. Just a quick plug for my Substack newsletter. If you aren't already subscribed, I would love if you would consider it. You will get 4 exclusive videos every single month and other exclusive content not available anywhere else. It's classicallyabby.substack.com, and I'll link it in the description box below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell and subscribe. So what does patriarchal mean? Patriarchal is the idea that a system is controlled for and by men. It is for their benefit. So marriage being a patriarchal system would mean that it is only for the benefit of men and that women are victimized by it. Why do feminists want to believe that marriage is patriarchal? Now, this comes down to our favorite topic here on this channel, critical theory. If you guys remember, critical theory is built on the idea of the hierarchy of oppression, that we view the world through the lens of victims and oppressors. And if anything ever had a history that through a modern lens doesn't seem to make sense to us and can then be perceived as bad, that system now has no value and needs to be torn down and rebuilt. Now you can imagine what happens when people try and tear down the systems that have allowed societies and civilizations to flourish and try to build societies based on their interpretation and their version of what should look ideal. That's always a very dangerous game to play, because how do we trust that your version of ideal is actually ideal? And how do we know how that's going to play out? Now, if we were to tear down marriage completely, you can imagine what would happen to society. We know because we've seen the breakdown of marriage already. Marriage is an incredible institution that provides stability to both women and their children. And we have seen what happens when single mothers have to raise their children on their own. They are left in poverty. They don't have support. The children have bad effects too. They are more likely to have a criminal record if they are raised in single parent homes, and they are more likely to be sexually abused. I mean, these are all terrible outcomes, and marriage is a solution to those things. So tearing down the institution of marriage isn't actually a great idea. So how are feminists able to make it so that if you search the history of marriage, the only thing you can find is that marriage was historically patriarchal? Well, the answer to that question is something called transformationism. I would quickly like to explain the difference between feminists and gender feminists. I would consider myself an equity feminist, but a gender feminist believes that women are born victims and men are born oppressors. Now you can already see how easily this fits into the narrative that marriage is historically patriarchal. And gender feminists have fought very hard in education. They have wanted to transform the knowledge base. This is all available in Christina Hoff Sommers' book, Who Stole Feminism? And that's where we get the word transformationism. They have tried to entirely rewrite history to tell the story and the narrative that they would like to see. So they either downplay the history of men's accomplishments. They might say that women played a larger role in political systems than they actually did. And they may also say, you guessed it, marriage was patriarchal in the past. So now when you look on the internet to try and find any sort of normal resources, just even-handed resources about the history of marriage, it's really, really difficult. So I wanted to try and do a little bit of the legwork for you guys. So we've raised a question. Are they right? Was marriage historically patriarchal? And even if it was, which I'm not agreeing to, but let's say it was, does that invalidate what marriage is today? Now, something we should keep in mind throughout this video is that the feminist lens is one that is modern. I don't know if you guys have ever watched a movie and noticed that it's a historical story told through the perspective of our modern eyes, where maybe there's a female character who really believes that she should be able to have a career that at the time was just not something that women would have considered. Now, I'm not saying that women can't have had similar thoughts in those times that we do now, but we are coming from a very different perspective than women in the medieval ages were. So keeping that in mind, when feminists are looking at history through a modern lens and putting and prescribing certain intentions on women and men who lived in a different time and who didn't have our modern perception of things, then it's going to be a misreading of history. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I also want to explain the difference between a couple of things that are going to come up in this video a few times, and that is the difference between legislation and the law. Legislation is a written rule. It is something that if you looked at hardcore on the paper, it looks really strict or it looks pretty unbelievable. The law is how it was actually practiced. Was this legislation actually practiced that way in real life? And that's a really big difference, right? It's kind of like a recipe and how you actually make something. The recipe might be very specific and might have certain rules, but if the general public isn't doing all of those rules and is changing the ingredients or is changing the way that they cook things, then they might get a totally different outcome at the end than the recipe actually says will happen. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about what was the history of marriage and what was its purpose. The earliest incidents of marriage occurred in around 2350 BCE in Mesopotamia. It's actually recorded in the Code of Ur-Nammu, which I personally had never heard of. I'd always heard of the Code of Hammurabi, but apparently the Code of Ur-Nammu is actually the oldest written code of law, and there are things in that code talking about wives and husbands. But something to keep in mind is that before we had agrarian communities where people settled down and farmed, there wasn't as much of a need for pair bonding. There wasn't as much of a need for marriages because people didn't need to settle down and prevent infighting within communities. When people started getting married, they needed a social structure, they needed a way to prevent violence between men, and they needed a way to figure out property rights. So these earliest forms of marriages really created stability within communities. You had a mother and a father, and it was very defined whose children were whose. And there was less violence and competition over women and children. Now, religious marriage started with the Torah and the Jews. And this is how we know marriage now. This was a religious ceremony, but it was really a contract. And in the Jewish contract, the ketubah, which is the same, pretty much the same today as it was when it was first created, it really just breaks down everything that the husband owes to the wife. Everything that the man must do, and if he does not do those things, the woman can divorce him with no cost. This includes financial obligations, but it also includes conjugal obligations. Essentially, if he isn't having enough sex with the wife, she could divorce him. If he wasn't supporting her financially, she could divorce him. Then Christians and Muslims followed suit with marriage, and interestingly, polygamy was ended with the Christians. It continued for the Jews until about 1,000 years ago, but this is another example of legislation versus law. The legislation as it was written for polygamy in the Torah is that if a man was going to have multiple wives, he needed to make sure that they had exactly equal everything. Everything had to be as if he had not taken another wife. And that was a very hard thing to do, as you might imagine, because he would have to provide for her a very good supportive life, give her conjugal rights, and do it in a way that would be equal between all of his wives. So as you might imagine, this happened very rarely practically. So the legislation said, yes, you can have multiple wives, but the law, the practice of that legislation, practically made it impossible. Now, thinking about this, how could this be patriarchal? The woman was not the property of her husband. People like to discuss it that way, that she belonged to her husband, but it's actually just factually incorrect. He had to provide for her. He had to protect her. He gave her stability when she was having children, which is one of the scariest things for women, is that when you have a baby, you won't have somebody to help you and care for you and your child. That was a wonderful thing about marriage, was that it prevented women from having to raise a family on their own, and it forced men to be responsible for not only their wife, but any children she would bear. And this is not a patriarchal system if you think about it practically. The man owed the woman quite a bit historically. I mean, he couldn't just walk away from her. Marriage was a great deal for the woman. And let's keep in mind that there's a really big difference between ownership and protection. The feminist modern lens placed on this might make it look like, oh, he bought her. The woman went from her father to her husband. She was property of both. At the time, I don't think women viewed it that way. That's how I would think. I would think women viewed it as, oh, I'm going from my house of my father, where he's protecting me, to the house of my husband, where he's protecting me. And I get to fulfill something that's really important to me. For women of that era, being a mother and being a wife were huge goals. And this is not to say that theoretically, if women wanted to do more, they couldn't have. Because in the Torah and in prophets and in writings, we see examples of women who are not only mothers, of course they are, and wives, but who are incredibly strong and leaders of the nation. And we also see an example of a father passing property through his daughters. Zelophehad had 5 daughters, and when he passed away, his daughters didn't want his property to be given to someone that wasn't his direct descendant. And in the Torah, they received his property. So this wasn't a patriarchal system. Women inherited property, and when they left their father's homes to go to their husband's homes, they shared that property with their husband. It didn't become his property, it was their property. Now, one of the things that feminists will say is that a man could have multiple wives, he could have concubines, but a woman couldn't do the same. Now, from a practical perspective, let's just clarify why this was probably the case, which is that we always know who the mother is of a child. We don't always know who the father is of a child. So for a woman to sleep with multiple men, it would mean that the father and patrilineal line would be unclear. In Judaism, interestingly, the Jewish line actually goes through the mother. So if your mother is Jewish, you are Jewish. Again, an interesting thing to keep in mind. But in addition, again in the Torah, it was very difficult to actually practically have a concubine or multiple wives. Now, the concubine issue has to do with some Jewish laws that prevent a young woman who is not married from purifying herself for conjugal relations. So that would be very difficult for them to actually practice. Some other things to know is that Catholics view marriage as a sacrament and Protestants view marriage as a covenant. And the first time that we see the actual term marriage used is around between 1200 and 1350 CE in Middle English. So what was early marriage for? There's a feminist theory that marriage was not for love for most of history. Marriage was to create political alliances, or to have clear bloodlines, or to deal with property rights. It provided social stability and allowed for the growth of world civilizations. It prevented jealousy. This is what you're going to see in every single article if you Google what was early marriage for? What was the purpose of early marriage? The theory then goes that by 1850, when the Industrial Revolution started happening, instead of marriage being a need, something that people needed where they had a partner and they would support them, and it didn't matter who that partner was, it was just about needing someone in order to have a family. The Industrial Revolution allowed people to leave their parents' homes, earn for themselves, and they didn't need to get married. They could get married if they so chose. And that is when marriage became about love. But here is the big question, and this is one that I could not find an answer to. How could marriage only be about practical choices if throughout art history we see that love and marriage are combined? Think about the ancient legend of Orpheus and Eurydice. In that story, Orpheus and Eurydice fall in love, and at their wedding ceremony, she gets bit by a snake and is dragged down to hell. Orpheus has to follow her down into Hades to save her, but he's not allowed to look back at her. And he is in love with her, and they got married. Now, there is more to that story, but that's not really relevant here. What's relevant is that they got married and were in love. Think about Shakespeare. Think about Beatrice and Benedict. Think about every single comedy of Shakespeare's where people fall in love and it ends in marriage. Now, that's not to say that there aren't marriages that are trying to be made for political alliances. I'm not discounting that that happened. What I'm trying to say is that love and marriage were thought of as going hand in hand. And especially for the 90% of people who weren't in the upper echelon of society, who didn't have to deal with political alliances and family dynamics, they were getting married for love. What other reason would they have? Even in the time of Henry VIII, the history tells us that he was in love with Anne Boleyn. He was obsessed with her, and that was part of the reason why he wanted to marry her. Now, it's not the only reason. Again, I'm not discounting that there was some politics tied in with marriage, but there was also love. And saying that marriage was entirely a patriarchal institution with no concept of love up until the 1850s is absurd to me. I mean, art is a reflection of history, but also the stories that we have of history tell us this. As well, it seems to me that if feminists perceive marriage as any sort of need, then they think it is delegitimate. It's not something that was freely chosen. And a need and a want can go hand in hand. A marriage between two people who want to support each other and love each other because marriage is important for societies, is good for their family structure, was good for their children, that doesn't totally delegitimize their relationship and their love. Another thing that also tends to drive me crazy is the idea that women were forced into marriages that they didn't want to engage in, and this was another patriarchal thing that would happen, where women were sent off to marry men to make those political alliances and allegiances. Well, has anyone ever considered that the men didn't want to get married to that woman either? Now, one thing that feminists will definitely bring up if you want to talk about marriage as a patriarchal institution is the idea of coverture. Now, coverture was a common law practice that a woman, when she was single, a femme sole, was an individual person and she could own property and she could do her own thing. And when she got married, she became a femme couverte, which meant a woman who was covered by her husband. Her identity, according to feminist theory, was subsumed into her husband's and she no longer existed as another person, as an individual. Now, this concept was written down by a fellow named Blackstone. And when you look this up, you will often find that they quote Blackstone by taking the first paragraph of his entry on coverture and the last sentence. Now, the first paragraph explains that a woman becomes part of her husband when she marries him. And the last sentence says, and this was a good thing, a way to turn Blackstone into a bad person. Now, I did a little bit of digging, and I found the entirety of Blackstone's entry on coverture. I am not convinced by this feminist theory. First of all, I found a book called Married Woman and the Law in Pre-Modern Northwest Europe, and it essentially says that coverture wasn't really practiced in the way that feminists want you to believe. Feminists want you to believe that the woman, her identity was totally subsumed into her husband's, yes, but that also all of her property became his. She had no legal rights. She couldn't run any businesses. She had no power over her children. All of this is the way that feminists pose this theory. Now, in this paper, in this book, it says that this wasn't really the case. Again, this may be a case of legislation versus law. In the legislation, it may have said that a woman becomes part of her husband. But in practice, this wasn't really the case. She did have legal rights. She did have rights to her own property. Now, what's even more interesting is that maybe the legislation isn't correct the way that feminists have shared it. So the way that Blackstone actually talks about coverture is very different than the way that feminists make it sound. He makes clear that the woman isn't entirely gone from existence when she marries her husband. She and her husband become one entity. It happens to be that it's under his name, but at the end of the day, it's really talking about how the two people are viewed as one legal person. It's not that her identity has been rid of, that she is now not important. He and she are one. They are the same. It's a religious perspective if you think about it. And his property becomes her property. She and he are just viewed as a legal same person. Now, From a modern lens, this sounds horrible. How could you get rid of a woman's identity? How could you throw her out like that? From a historical lens, it's entirely different. People from that time viewed themselves in the context of their community. They viewed themselves in the context of their family. They didn't see themselves in this Enlightenment, individualistic way. They didn't see themselves as my goals and my purposes are unique from everyone else I know and love. They viewed themselves as part of one thing. And that meant that a woman marrying her husband and starting a family and having her identity merged with his was not weird. So this is just a different view on things, and one that maybe is more accurate. So is it possible that this is a misreading of this common law? That there wasn't this sort of property owning right to your wife? That instead the man and the woman were viewed as one person? Now, this did cause some problems. I'm not saying it didn't, but it wasn't this patriarchal view of marriage like feminists want us to believe. So how did men benefit from marriage and how did women benefit? Men benefited because they had a very clear line from their wife to their children. They knew who their children were. That was a big benefit for men because then they could have patrilineal descendants, and that was a good and important thing for societies. How did women benefit? Well, women got support. They had a husband who could provide for them. They knew that their husband was going to be there even after they had children. They knew that they would be supported and protected. And these were huge and important things. I mean, can you imagine in the Middle Ages women not having that? It was incredibly important and not at all patriarchal. It was from a protective perspective. And why did women take their husbands' surnames? So that is part of the coverture thing, where when women married their husbands and they became one unit, she took on his name. Now, for a very long time, surnames didn't even exist. People just went by Jake or Jerry or Lisa. But then when there were too many people living in one community, it was too confusing. So often it became, what does this person do? Taylor, that kind of thing. And then that last name would transfer to his wife when they got married. So today, why do feminists believe that men benefit from marriage more than women? This is something I thought about before I even started on researching this video. A very feminine perspective on marriage is that men gain everything from marriage. They gain a woman to clean their house and a woman to cook their meals, a woman to have sex with them whenever they want. And I don't mean that in a negative or dangerous way. But at the end of the day, if a man is uninterested in having a familial life or having children, and he just wants to continue to be a bachelor, then he gains absolutely nothing from getting married because he could pay someone to clean his house. He could pay someone to cook for him or go out to eat every night. He could pay someone or meet someone to have sex with. Men don't view all of the things that women do for them as the reason to get married or the best part of marriage. A good man gets married because he wants a family and he wants to support his wife. A man would never choose to get married for any of those other reasons because, again, he could just get those outside of marriage by paying for them. If we view marriage in that realistic way from a man's perspective, what a man gets from marriage is love, is support, is a family, is something he can be proud of, something he can build. Those are the things that men get. But women get things that are much more practical. They get support. They get a man to help raise their children. They know that they aren't going to have to go it alone. And they are protected. And that is huge. And we see the results of that in our modern society. When women don't get married, how much harder they have it, how much harder it is on their children. And when they do, the happiness they find, the sexual fulfillment they get, the protection they have. It is so much more beneficial to women to get married than it is not to. And historically, I don't think that marriage was patriarchal. There may have been. I'm not going to discount and say that there was no situation in which there were patriarchal motives for a marriage. But for the most part, the institution of marriage was instituted for the protection of women, not because men wanted control over them. So that is my video for today. I would love to know your guys' thoughts in the comments. I'd love to have a conversation with you about this because it's a really interesting topic and it's really difficult to do research on. So if you have trouble finding some of the sources that I'm talking about today, I will link some of them below. But I would love for more people to do research on this topic and find the truth about the history of the patriarchy in marriage. I had a really hard time with it myself, and this is not a dissertation. This is just an exploration. So, thank you so much for watching today's video. Make sure that you are subscribed to my channel and ring that notification bell. If you haven't already subscribed to my Substack newsletter, I would love if you would consider going ahead and doing that. Over there, I share more information about how to be a classic and elegant woman, as well as just classic perspectives on the world, just like we do over here. I'd also love if you would follow me on social media. It's at Classically Abby, absolutely everywhere. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!